Welcome to each of you. Thank you for joining this session, Perspectives on Paths to a Sustainable Recovery. The COVID-19 crisis has, of course, shaped how companies engage with employees, with communities, and customers, certainly through these past few months. And there's a lot of speculation about what that might mean on a go-forward basis as well. This change in behavior has massive implications for sustainable investing, as we've seen strong performance of sustainable investments over the past several months, the allocation of capital toward more sustainable investments, and of course, some questions about what that means for the future. So today at the BlackRock Global Summit 2020, we will hear from several voices that matter as we explore the intersection of sustainability and the coronavirus crisis. Joining us is Mindy Lover, CEO and President of Ceres, Fiona Reynolds, CEO of the Principles for Responsible Investment, Marissa Drew, CEO of Impact Advisory and Finance for Credit Suisse, Peter Baker, President and CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and I'm Mary Catherine Lader, BlackRock's Head of Aladdin Sustainability. So let's get to it. So to start, the overall theme of the Global Summit is, can sustainability accelerate recovery? Marissa, let me start with you, because you, like I, are also at a firm that manages money and investments. What's your view as you're talking to clients about how choices around sustainable investment can inform either the intention of capturing recovery opportunities or even perhaps accelerating it, as our session suggests?
Well, certainly at the heart of what I do is the mobilization, like you, of private capital to try to help solve some of the world's challenges. So in a way, I travel in an ecosystem that is self-reinforcing, but it is clear that we have seen an enormous enthusiasm from investors. The level of engagement that I see now from all our client segments, whether they be private clients in their individual capacity by driving their personal investments towards something that is more sustainable or impactful, through to the institutional community, of course, but even our corporates. So really across the board, I'd say there's a whole new level of desire to try to marry capital with doing something more positive. And as far as the acceleration, does it accelerate the recovery? I just sort of see everywhere I look this push to try to make the recovery the Build Back Better system. So let's take this moment of reflection, this pause that we've had, say, how can we do it better? And then around the world, when you see policymakers, I sit in the UK, and I'm captivated by this concept that it doesn't have to be a trade-off.
Fiona, much of your role at PRI is helping to advocate for those policies with both public sector and private sector leaders. How do you respond to Marissa's comments, and what are you doing to capture the opportunities of this crisis?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I completely agree with Marissa. I mean, sustainability has really come to the fore. Anyone who has been in doubt about sustainability issues, I now think understands the interconnectedness of issues. So I keep saying that people really can now see through COVID-19 that if you don't have healthy people and you don't have a healthy planet, you can't possibly have a healthy economy. The three things go together. And at the beginning of this pandemic, I had so many people, particularly in the media and other people, who said to me, well, surely sustainability is going to fall off the agenda. You know, COP26 going to be delayed, and it has been now, and people aren't going to worry about climate change because business and governments are going to have other priorities. That hasn't been the case. I think sustainability is being very much at the fore. But what we need to do, making sure going forward, and just mentioning about Build Back Better, is that, with stimulus packages that are going to total somewhere between 10 and $20 trillion, really we have to think about that what we do today and tomorrow over the next couple of years is really going to shape the future of our economy, but also of society for the next decade. And the private sector, business and investors, really need to play a significant part of that solutions, because governments alone are not going to be able to fund the transformation that we need. And I think that we've got such a great opportunity from the sustainability community to make sure that we're part of ensuring that, the new normal is the world that we want to be in, that we have an economy fit for the 21st century, and that it's one that really has environmental and social aims at the heart, and that we can create the jobs for the future and the skills that we also need for the future. So as they say, never waste a good crisis. And I think from our perspective, from the investment community, that's what we're very much trying to do. How do we push sustainability forward?
And Peter, on that note, you wrote an article recently saying that CEO leadership would be absolutely critical in pushing sustainability forward and trying to not waste this crisis and create some systemic change. So what specific actions do you think in 2020 you would hope to see from leaders who care about really using this to accelerate sustainability?
Well, I think for every CEO and every leader in business, the perspective of risk will be completely changed. Most supply chains in the world found themselves ill prepared for the shock that COVID brought. We all realize that climate change has the potential to bring even bigger shocks to our systems. So how do we get prepared? So the first step that companies need to do is integrate sustainability now truly into their governance, into their risk assessment, into their decision making, eventually in their disclosures to capital markets, their investors or financiers. The second thing we really need to do is we need to, as this system transformation gets underway, understand that if you implement sustainability well, you're really building the competitive position of your company. So this is not CSR type, yeah, let's do some good on this side. This is truly about the strategic positioning of your company. And then thirdly, as you disclose transparently the process that your company is making, really find new ways to engage the investors in the capital markets. Now, we need to move to a system where the cost of capital of a company is determined by its sustainability performance as well as its financial performance. If we get that mix right, risk assessment, decision making, inclusion in strategy, and disclosures to capital markets with a fresh engagement, basically what you're saying is all the recommendations that TCFD put out about 2 years ago will now get much more wind under their wings, and that will fundamentally change the system.
Mindy, the work that Peter is talking about is certainly your work every day as well. I'm curious how optimistic you are that we'll see real change in the next 12 months, and what exactly you'd be asking CEOs to do differently as they think about incorporating ESG issues into their decision making and strategies.
Right. Well, let me just pull the lens back a tiny bit in response to a few of my colleagues and then go right into that question. Right now, I think Fiona mentioned it, there will be about $12 trillion moving into our economy to remedy and to help build us out of the COVID economic crisis. That's a global number. And that's stimulus packages and infrastructure packages, certainly 2 to 4 trillion in the United States. Not all of that is in the marketplace yet, but some of it is, and it's moving out quickly. That money could be spent in one of two ways. It could move us back to a business as usual, highly fossil fuel driven economy, or it could be around a clean energy, clean transportation, start evolving us as it relates to the chemicals we use and the cement we use and the steel we use and the way we build bridges and schools and the infrastructure of electric vehicles. We didn't know that money existed on planet Earth. It didn't 4 months ago. But because we're also eager and anxious, and appropriately so, people are suffering, to build out of COVID, that money has materialized from Federal Reserve banks, from global treasuries or country treasuries. So right this minute, if we are not focused on how that 12 or 13 or 14 trillion dollars is spent, we either set us back to a world where our kids don't have a chance, or we have an opportunity to build out better or build back better, as two of my colleagues have said, where we're still creating jobs, we're jump-starting the economy where it has fallen off because of COVID, but we're doing it in a way that's about a clean energy future that can be as profitable and certainly one that sustains us into the future. And so to come back to what we ask of the companies we work with, we do expect integration of sustainability or ESG from the boardroom to the supply chain. We might train corporate boards, help them set goals so we get to a Paris-aligned future, that we know where we need to get, and we can't start in 2045. We need to start today. So set audacious goals for the next 20, 30 years, starting today. Apply those goals and standards to their supply chain. If they have climate and human rights and other standards in the States, make sure we're applying that equity and fairness around the world, and to start changing what they do, what they buy, what kind of products, and it will help them with their employees, with their consumers, with their profitability. And we work with hundreds of investors. That's what they want to see from their companies: integration of climate risk and opportunity, of sustainability risk and opportunity into everything they do. And this is not about changing, trading off values for value. This is about making money, creating a long-term sustainable future, doing so in a way that's good for the company, but also good for the planet. And the final point is those very same companies that Peter and I are referencing, or Fiona, as it relates to investors, need to join us and stand up and support policy and support those stimulus packages to move us to a sustainable future.
I have a number of questions about policy and just what's going to be enough given the really dramatic impact that climate change could have on the economy. But first, Marissa, I would love a reality check from you. When we say that it's not about trading off value for values, look, I talk with all kinds of investors all over the world and off the record settings every day, as you do too. Is that a debate that you think is really settled, or how much of your time is still trying to make that case, trying to illustrate that the data is there such that sustainable investing does not have to mean a trade-off in return?
I think it depends on who my audience is. So I think the institutional community for sure now is seeing, just through the crisis alone, we see the performance, and all kudos to BlackRock for some of the good work you've done from a research point of view, looking at the ESG leaders and their performance through the crisis in terms of the share price performance. When I speak to people as individuals, though, I think there's an education to be had. I do often have a conversation about whether this is trading off return if people are aligning values with their investing habits. So the more cases that we can demonstrate that we do generate good returns, and again, I am always quoting everybody's research. I'm a big believer in collaboration in this space because we need the education, but the more good case studies that we have, the better off we are able to drive that further bucket, if you will, of the private investment, which then, of course, is giving asset managers capital and then demanding of them certain things. So there's sort of a holistic value chain effect. When we also think about the smartest investors who have had tremendous success over decades, increasingly one by one, they're joining our party too and waving the flag and saying this is an enormous investment opportunity. So Jeff Ubben at Value Act, who is relinquishing part of his old fund, jumped in. And he said, when you address something like climate change, which is the single most important thing that we need to be investing in for global prosperity, I'm paraphrasing his words, but he says, when you're addressing climate change with a business solution, in his words, he says, that's a 10 times your money deal. And that kind of mantra, I think, is what we need to continue to reinforce in whatever way we can. But good data and good case studies, I think, is key to that.
So to how quantify it's a 10 times your money deal, we still have some gaps, right? That's what we at BlackRock in particular really focus through our technology platform, Aladdin, and trying to address now is that there's growing awareness, as we've all spoken about so far. There's growing data about the potential risks of not having more sustainable strategies and investments, but still kind of quantifying even specifically climate risk is a little bit challenging and still an evolving space. Now it's evolving rapidly. Fiona, what do you see as near-term needs to help make climate risk in particular sort of more tangible and actionable?
Sure. Well, first of all, just on that discussion of, I think that the sustainability discussion is moving. Now, I often recognize that in the United States, in particular, and I'm not saying that it's true of every organization in the United States, there's a bit more of a black and white, black letter of the law sort of issue around the issue of fiduciary duty and sustainability. But in many parts of the world, and certainly in a lot of our signatory base, rather than just thinking about ESG from the fact of how does ESG, how do ESG issues come in and affect my portfolio from a risk return point of view, more of our signatories are starting to think about how do ESG factors in my portfolio affect the real world. And we have to have that discussion as well. I think on this whole issue of climate change, though, which is obviously a huge issue for the market, as business, to ensure that we have an orderly transition to net zero. Because the longer that we delay, and we keep delaying, and we can say that most governments around the world have really been very insufficient in dealing with the commitments that they've made to the Paris Agreement that nearly every country of the world has signed. But as the reality of climate change become increasingly apparent, it's not when governments will act, or it's not if, it's when. And the longer we leave it, the more that we are going to see that more drastic and urgent issues, policy issues, are going to need to be brought in. So we're seeing across the world that there's many countries, including the EU, that's now got a Green New Deal, and it's leading the way. The UK's got a net zero target, as have countries such as Canada, Norway, Denmark, and the list goes on. But also achieving net zero doesn't just magically happen. The only way governments can actually achieve them is by changing the policy settings. Now, that's policy settings like, for example, the date that you're banning the internal combustion engine, which is happening in the UK and in other questions. So policy change will happen, and investors need to be in front of this sort of business rather than waiting for it to come and drive over the top of them and really impact their investments in portfolios because they're not thinking about them. So we really think that, for example, the levers that are going to be pulled by government and are around coal phase out. The UK's got a date that it's committed to phase out coal, then phasing out and bringing in electric vehicles and having dates, obviously carbon pricing. And there's so many things about energy efficiency, land use, etc., that I all think are going to be driven forward by many countries. And I think that the message that we certainly try to give to investors is you need to act now, or you're going to pay the price later, because this is happening and it's a reality.
In that spirit of acting now, I'm curious, who are we looking to as leaders? Who are we looking to really step out, whether you think of a specific government or a specific company? Mindy, who are you looking to as a leader right now for the second half of 2020? For example, I'm thinking of, we had the Bank of England, for example, took the lead in identifying what climate stress tests might look like, but that's been put on hold to some extent, understandably, given the challenges of the current crisis. So even for the next 6 months, what names should we be looking out for?
Well, first of all, we need to look at all categories. Let us start with companies. And I could give you 100 examples. This is not the time for 100 examples. But Jeff Bezos stepping up with a 2040 net zero pledge. So that's 10 years sooner than most. It's obviously a company of inordinate power and magnitude. If he could bring along 100 other major companies to move the needle, that's the kind of audacious, ambitious, must-do attitude and action we need to see. And then many of our asset owners, Fiona works with investors, we do. Some of our largest asset owners, people who manage $300 billion, whether it's the California Public Pensions Fund or the California Teachers Fund or the New York State Fund, we are working with them to come out with a plan for Paris-aligned portfolios. So not only are they to tell companies, we want you to be Paris-aligned, they've got to be Paris-aligned. A few others, we have to have policy. Going one by one, company by company by company, does not get us there quickly enough. The large companies are moving, they need to move more quickly. There are tens of thousands of companies below the Russell 1000 who aren't doing anything. We need policy so there's a level playing field. Right now, carbon pollution costs society billions and billions and billions of dollars a year, and in most places, it's priced at zero. So when you have something free, you get more of it. This is something we don't want more of. We need a price on carbon. And I think around the world, and perhaps after the election in the United States, that debate will come back together. And I believe it will. And our Federal Reserve Bank needs to follow the lead of the Bank of England. We are working with them every day and with leaders in every one of the federal offices to make climate a systemic risk, meaning the risk is to all of our economy, and they need to be part of the discussion and regulation, not just Congress or not just the Securities and Exchange Commission. And finally, I would ask the SEC to mandate the disclosure of climate risk, because you can't act until you understand the risk. They've got a duty to do that. They adopted guidance to do that, and they're not doing it. So 5 simple things. Of course, they're not simple. If we can move on all of those fronts, we would make a good deal of progress.
Indeed. Peter, I see you nodding. Would you add a few to that list?
Well, I would give a generic answer and then name a few names. I think generically what you need to do is make a list of which are the companies that have signed up to science-based targets, because that's where the climate change journey starts for a company. Set yourself a target to get to 1.5 degree or net zero carbon by no later than 2050, and have a realistic plan to halve the emissions in the next decade. Any company who does that will probably qualify. The second element, which are the companies that have signed up to TCFD, to bring this stuff in their governance and be transparent towards capital markets. If you look at it, like Mindy says, you probably want to go sector by sector. You know, I thought some of the companies that stood out were probably BP, oil and gas, that as the first major oil and gas company came out with a net zero target, swiftly followed by Shell. In the food and fast-moving consumer space, Danone is really pushing hard for regenerative agriculture. Unilever emboldened their ambitions with a holistic plan that captured not only climate change, but also biodiversity loss and some of the social aspects. So there's the big brand names out there, but I think the generic, is there a framework, science-based targets, TCFD, that companies adhere to, and then start through their disclosures measuring whether they actually do and not just talk.
Marissa, Fiona, anything else you'd add to the list of specific leaders, specific policies for the next 6 months?
Well, so Mindy already mentioned some of the things investors are doing. So we have a group of our signatories who have formed the Asset Owner Alliance. So they have committed themselves to a net zero target by 2050. And then they're now working on what will the near-term target be, because it could be quite easy to set a 2050 target. We probably won't be sitting in our jobs by then, but what is the near-term target? So, and then how do you actually get there? And they're working together on that. And then sector by sector, how do we do it? And I think people taking that leadership within an industry, working out how to do things, gives others confidence then that it can be done, that they're not sitting out there alone. And, then that helps inform with the asset owners, the discussion that needs to happen with the investment managers. So if I'm an asset owner, I can't get there myself if other people manage my money. I need to be clear to the managers what I expect. I need to embed it in my mandates. I need to be able to measure what they're doing. I need to have the data to be able to do that. And I think on the company side, so it's the investment side, on the company side, Peter already mentioned some of those companies, but I thought that it was really great to see Shell, for example, BP, coming out while this crisis was very much at its peak, saying we're dealing with the crisis, but we still have to deal with climate change. And we're making net zero commitments and still engaging with their shareholders on that issue. I thought that was really significant leadership.
Peter, I think you had one more point to add.
I was going to say, given probably your audience, I think the role of shareholders cannot be underestimated here. In my community, the community of business leaders that care for sustainability, one of the most shared pieces of news was the vote against the CEO for not moving fast enough on climate change. That causes ripples in the corporate community that way more than any report that an NGO can put out that climate is important. So I think the vote in AGMs is a tool that has not been used enough, and I would say is a very important power that the investor community has.
Well, a critical link in being able to use that power credibly and with confidence is knowing that doing so is acting on your fiduciary responsibility, right? And so that gets at some of what we've talked about in terms of the importance of having better tools, having better data, being able to better understand and quantify the impact of climate change, and not have to be independent sort of solo advocates. But to the extent that this becomes widely understood as real financial and sort of corporate risks, then it becomes more evident as something that should be part of those kinds of annual general meetings, as you suggested. Marissa, how do you all as investors think about that element of sort of shareholder engagement and even activism that Peter mentioned?
I was just going to add to that, that's how it augment is that the power of the investor dollar is enormous. And where we have seen tremendous change in response from the corporate side, you can either feel the underlying change in your customers or your clients as a business, or you can react to shareholder pressure. I think both of those two things go hand in hand in some respects. So when we think about some of the very successful campaigns of coalitions of shareholders in a constructive way, saying we actually expect of the companies we invest in to have hard targets, perhaps, or alternatively, the organization FAIR, that is got groups of shareholders to really go and talk to the companies they're invested in about fat-free farming and sustainable agriculture. That has changed whole industry practice by using the power of that dollar. So increasingly, we believe that that is another way, because as one of my colleagues said, some of the companies don't even know what to do. They're a little bit nervous. They're feeling pressure. They're seeing the underlying change in their business, and they're saying, well, what do I do? How do I tell my climate narrative? Are there science-based targets that are beyond CO2 emissions that I ought to be looking at? So I think helping them along the journey in a constructive way through engagement is a key portion of how we move some of the particularly high carbon emitters along the journey.
Fiona?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add about the shareholder board. And Mindy's organisation series and PRI are part of Climate Action 100+. I think this has been a significant initiative. BlackRock has recently joined it. So that's got 450 investors, 45 trillion in assets under management. The important thing about it is that it's dealing with systemic issues, and it's all of these investors asking the same questions. So we want the biggest emitters in the world to set an emissions reduction target, to report online in line with the TCFD. And we want to understand the discussion that they're having at the board level and their governance about what their climate plan is, how they're transitioning. So rather than have all of these investors going off and asking all of these different things, we're pushing in the same direction. And then there is the voting that happens. There are the shareholder resolutions. Of course, it's not about acting in concert. Every organisation that's in Climate Action 100+ makes their own decisions about how they vote. But I think that is where engagement has to move, not sort of little engagement that's a bit tick boxing. Have I done this? Tick. It has to be about the big issues, and it has to be collaborative and really moving so that companies aren't also confused, because I hear that from companies. Yesterday this investor A came to see me and they asked for ABC, and then today company B, investor B comes and they ask me for exactly the opposite. That does not get us anywhere.
So I have one question for you, Mindy, and then I want to move on to other elements and dimensions of sustainability, particularly emphasis on sort of social factors. But Mindy, Fiona mentioned the importance of essentially having a sort of like common calls to action that can create sort of consensus and accelerate movement. How standards is a frequent refrain in the world of sustainability in every category, whether it's in climate or ESG and metrics broadly. What do you think are useful efforts to coalesce around the same sets of rules, or do you think we already have enough out there? We have TCFD, we have SASB, and it's a matter of just adhering to what already exists as templates for standardization.
We hear the excuse every single day of, I can't act because I don't have all the data, or all the information is not exactly the same as my colleague down the hall, or if I disclose data and somebody doesn't, we'll be at a disadvantage. I think The days of that are over. Do we have perfect standards? No. Are there perfect standards for everything in finance? No. We have enough to be moving to get started. Other things will come along, but we've got reporting standards. We've got some mandatory standards at a government level in different countries. We've got the TCFD, which is a terrific set of standards. Let's use them. Is it perfect? No. Will 3 years from now, will we find better amendments to it? Probably. It doesn't mean that we don't have enough to move forward. Science-based targets, as Peter's been talking about, it is about following the science. We know the North Star. It's getting to that 1.5 degree world. What does it take to get there? How do we look at it from a scientific lens? So we don't have perfect standards. We have plenty to move the debate forward, not only on climate, but on ESG overall. And really, it is time to act and not worry about the perfect standards, but instead to move on with what we have and keep refining along the way. SASB's done some terrific work. GRI as a reporting standard is very strong for going beyond financial markets. We've got what it takes. We've got to actually have the audacity to move forward with what we've got.
Absolutely. Moving on to another dimension of sustainability. So the social responsibilities and opportunities or risks in the investment landscape. There's been a lot of talk that in the wake of COVID-19, there's more focus on S. And that I think is a false construct because we need to be thinking about all of these simultaneously. That's the point of sustainability. But to the extent that this is an opportunity to refine our understanding of what data we need to be collecting, what companies need to be doing to think about social risks, that this is a welcome opportunity to do that, whether it's about resilience in the wake of great challenges and exogenous shocks like COVID or a pandemic, or whether it's about what drives employee loyalty, retention, and even how we think about elements of social equality and how they refract inside a corporation or an investment opportunity. So Fiona, I'm curious from PRI's perspective, what are you doing in the wake of that kind of conversation right now when there's a discussion that there's, quote, more focus on S? What are you guys doing about that to take advantage of that opportunity?
I completely agree with you that you need to look holistically at the issues, but for some reason people don't. And I think that COVID-19 has really just exacerbated the systemic social issues across the globe, from inequality and inclusion, decent work, social protections. And I think it's really unveiled a lot of the shortfalls in our economic system. So, the ITUC have estimated that up to 300 million jobs can be lost, and this is going to cause some people to slip back in poverty. I also think that what we've seen through this crisis is that there's sort of two types of people in this crisis. So there's the people like us who are getting paid and we're working at home, and, we can homeschool our kids. And yeah, sure, we've got a bit of inconvenience in our life, but if we're healthy, that's all we have. But we also see lots of other people who are in jobs where they're on the front line, or they have no sick pay, they have no social protections. They are feeling, even if they're sick, which isn't helping anyone, that they have to go to work. So we need to really not just be looking at the climate issues, we need to be looking at the social protection issues, we need to be looking at social inclusion issues, all things that we are thinking about and have been in our organisation, and making sure, really, as people have been talking about, that as we come out of COVID-19, that we really need a new social contract, that it's quite broken in many countries in the world, and people just don't have enough protection in their jobs. And I think that it's causing a lot of, if we look at, a lot of the disruption that's happening at the moment and a lot of the social divisions that are happening, a lot of it stems from inequality. It's no good for anybody and it's no good for the economy, and we need to prioritise it. And I think as we're looking to, we're talking about the fact that we need to build back better. We're talking about, that there's between 10, 20 trillion that's going to be spent on the recovery. That recovery needs to focus on creating jobs, but they need to be jobs that are focused on the skills that we need for the future, but we also need to make sure that they are good jobs and that we have good social protections in place. If we look at some of the reasons of countries in the world that don't want to make this transition to a low carbon economy, it's because they've got lots of people in jobs in the fossil fuel sector. And that can't hold us back, but we can't leave those people on the scrap heap either. We need to make sure that there is a just transition to a net zero world, and that we factor in workforces and we factor in communities, or we're not going to get anywhere.
Marissa, what do you make of this increased focus on social factors and sustainability?
Well, the points that I would add to that are that I think there was a recognition through the crisis that the E and the S are inextricably interlinked. I don't know that people drew those conclusions and those linkages. So this concept of healthy planet and healthy people. If you don't have a healthy planet, we are going to have more sickness. We are going to have more pandemics and so on. So I think that is a sort of a light bulb moment for many people, that those two things, or actually all of them, the G2, mean that you make the business case. So it's not always just we must do this because it's the right thing to do. Look at the companies that have outperformed. The companies, I think, that have demonstrated they've taken all of the ESG into consideration, to me, are the ones that have outperformed through the crisis. Why? Because they've been more aware of the total factors. They've demonstrated more resiliency. They probably, by the virtue of better governance, had better scenario planning. And then I would point to the companies that handled, even when they were going through, say, a furlough process, the companies who handled that well versus those who didn't. Just think the headline risk of the ones who didn't. So as we come out of the crisis, then those are the companies that are going to create, I think, customer affinity over the longer term. They're going to be the companies who will be the employers of choice. So the business case, I think, is becoming very clear.
So just as you said, the E and the S are linked. So are the E and the S linked to the context in which a company operates, right? So whether that's the social lens through which you look at a company's operations is affected by the social construct and the social contract of the companies in which they are most their operations are most concentrated, or the environmental effects of where their operations are. How do each of you think about how we adjust these themes we've been talking about, frankly, at a global level, for local realities?
What we have seen is social and environmental issues matter to the strength of the company. You can't be a strong company where your employees are motivated to work for you, where new employees who you're recruiting the best and the brightest, where your customers believe you are not acting anymore in the best interests of your employees, of your community, and so on. And it does matter. One of the large beverage companies that make a carbonated project went into India a number of years ago and started 2 new plants and invested a huge amount of money. And the people in the community said, we don't have enough water, and said, we're taking away your license to operate here. You can't. Enormous loss to the company, from reputation, from money, from. Right now, any company that doesn't look holistically at environmental and social issues, on how they're treating their workforce. Look at the companies right now where a huge number of their employees have been affected by COVID, and they're suggesting the company is not being careful enough in taking care of their employees. That is a company that's going to have a black mark for a long time. Consumers do care. People care about where they work, and it matters to the bottom line. Any company who thinks we will be stronger because we will pay people peanuts, and we will try and get the most out of them for the most hours. And in the developing world, we'll really pay peanuts. We'll pay as little as possible. Those aren't the companies that are going to thrive, because people are going to push back. They're going to have shutdowns. They're going to have labor issues. They're going to have consumer issues. It's urgent to look at how these very issues run to the financial well-being of any company. And I would take it one step further. These are risks and opportunities for companies that are bigger than most, and corporate boards need to be involved in them. They've got a fiduciary duty to understand the risks of a company. And these are the kind of risks that may very well have been on the back burner or not considered 5 years ago. Now they need to be considered at every part of the enterprise, starting at the board level.
So I would just say, of course, there's regional differences. And of course, economies are different. But I think the baseline of what people should expect has to be the same around the world. So people should expect to be able to get a living wage. Now that wage will be different in different countries. They should be able to go to work and have safety and be protected and not be put in difficult, in situations where they're working in a way that there's huge numbers of accidents or deaths. That should be the same for everybody. Basic human rights should be there for every single person. So I think you have to have a baseline that you just say, no, this is what everybody in the world should be entitled to: safety, living wages, basic human rights. Then on top of that, of course, there's regional differences, but it's not enough. It's not. I don't think you can just say, oh, okay, well, these people are in this particular country, and so really, what does it really matter about whether they are safe when they go to work or that they can feed their family? That's not a way. That's not a way for us to have harmony in the world at all.
Peter, Marissa, anything else to add on this one?
The only thing I would say is that we do have to be sensitive to the developing world, who face much different, many different challenges. So if I can just pick one sector, say that pulls at people's heartstrings, something like animal conservation. We're facing a moment now, say in Africa, where we have come a very long way to retrain poachers not to go after animals because you have tourism, and that's created sustainable livelihood for those people who would otherwise seek a different outcome. Now, during the shutdown in COVID, those people cannot feed their families. The tourism has dried up, and we're seeing an increase in poaching. And, so when we talk about Build Back Better, sometimes we put our Western lens on things, and it's you don't have those social systems or plan Bs, if you will. So I 100% agree that everybody needs that basic human right to a good livelihood and a good opportunity. But if you're making a choice between killing an animal and putting food on your table, or being a conservationist, those are really tough choices. So I think over time, what's incumbent upon us as we do think about building back better is to try to demonstrate to them that if we can help in whatever way to maintain and preserve the ecosystems that will be sustainable in the long term, and show the benefit of making those investments for the long term and how they will then come back and create a return for those communities, that's got to be a part of the equation. But it's a sensitive topic in some of those areas today.
Peter?
I would probably put a bit of a health warning on it all. I mean, I am in complete agreement that the S will gain a lot of momentum as a result of COVID, and everybody is now talking about it. But the reality is the data quality, the tools to measure and to manage the science-based targets are simply not there in many of the areas, not the way that they have been developed on the environmental issues. So I think we need to translate this conversation quite quickly in what are the material issues that on the social side we wish to focus on. Now, obviously, human rights in supply chains is one. I would argue living wages throughout supply chains could be another one. And so let's quickly organize a global conversation about what are the 10 big indicators that we all want to start measuring. What are the tools we do not yet have, or the standards we need to make those measurements happen on a comparable basis, and then step by step drive this in, because otherwise we're going to continue to talk about feel-good stuff, but fundamentally don't make the change that we need.
When we think about things like natural capital solutions, where in very small communities, we've proven things like natural coastal barriers by planting mangroves are much more effective and cost efficient. When you're in the debate of, do I build back with a cement barrier wall for coastal protection, or do I use mangroves? We're going to need to demonstrate to those who are participating in that Build Back Better, whether it's sustainable ag or regenerative infrastructure, whatever it is, a lot more of those examples, so that then we do have data to prove to people that those are financially material and that you can bank on them as a better solution. So that's my call or cry out.
Just on the developing countries, I think that one of the things that we also need to be very cognizant of during COVID-19, and in the recovery and coming back to jobs being available in those communities is last year I chaired a financial services commission on modern slavery and human trafficking through the UN. And, you know, there's 40 million people in some form of modern slavery and human trafficking today. It's 1 in 185 people. It's $150 billion annual business for traffickers. It's important to the finance sector because you have to launder your money somehow, and you do it in the finance sector in many cases. For investors, a lot of issues in supply chains. So this is more people than in slavery than in any history of the world. But one of the sad things about COVID-19 is that traffickers pick on the vulnerable, and we're going to see far more vulnerable people. And I think that we will see an increase rather than a decrease in this issue. And it's the other reason why we in the developed world have to be very conscious of things about supply chains, making sure that suppliers are paid so workers down the chain get paid within this issue. And we are thinking about this from all economies, not just from the developed economy side of things, because I really do think on that side we're going to see human tragedy happening if we're not careful.
Mindy?
I want to be sure that we don't overly separate E&S issues. They are so interconnected as to sometimes be inseparable from my perspective. And if we just take climate change and how it exacerbates problems, particularly in the developing world, but everywhere else, climate change will cause less water availability. We already know that. We will have about 30% less water than we need as a world community in 2026 or 2027. That comes out of the World Economic Forum, not an environmental piece. And no company could survive without enough water to run manufacturing. It will decrease their share value. But the humanity of it, right now, women who are already in developing world, spending hours trying to get enough water for their families, that will double, that will triple. The issues of climate, people have traditionally thought it's an E issue, the environment. It impacts those who have been most affected by other tragedies of the economy more so than any other issue. And we've got to be mindful as we take on climate. It's not about the planet. It is about the people on the planet and whether my kids and your kids will have a future. So S and E, there are separate issues there, but they are so integrated. And we've got to look at this holistically when we look at how to tackle some of the world's biggest problems.
So in our final 5 minutes, I want to ask each of you, we've touched on a number of different things, whether it's the importance of regulation and policy and standards or lack of excuses in that category. We talked about the integration and links between these different issues. What's one question that each of you thinks is really critical to ask to raise the credibility of what it means to do sustainable investing and to advance, to create progress in this area that we may not have touched on yet?
I'll start. So if I was talking to a company and wanting to drive sustainability forward, and I'm coming from the investment point of view, I would really want to understand how does sustainability, how do they manage sustainability and manage profit? So how are they managing profit, people and planet? Tell me about it all in an integrated way. How does their work contribute both positively and negatively to sustainable outcomes in the real world? These are the things that I want to know about the company, because I think it would tell me what was a really good long-term company that I want to invest in.
So meaning articulate what the trade-offs are, articulate where companies and leadership are having to make hard decisions.
I don't know that they have to trade off. I just want to know how they bring it all together. Yeah. So I don't want them to just judge a company by its financial accounts. I don't think that's enough these days.
Mindy?
Sure. So one thing, I would ask major financial enterprises, including BlackRock, if in fact the data is clear that we're seeing no compromise in investments, if you factor in social and environmental issues, how do we move a company who's literally a trendsetter in everything? You are trendsetters, and appropriately so, from a fifth or whatever number of sustainable investing products to 50% to 70%. And how does that happen much more quickly than it might otherwise? You all have extraordinary power. I'm not putting you on the spot now, but those are the kind of questions I'm asking colleagues at all the large financial institutions.
No, I think it's an important and fair question. We've certainly set a target of $1 trillion in 10 years, but seeing just the flows in the first quarter of this year suggests that we could be thinking we have more data basically to base those goals and those targets on, rather than just aspirations and hope. And I think we welcome observations and input from each of you and your organizations as you see how exactly we and others can be doing that. Peter?
Yeah, I would say COVID has proven to all of us that we can radically change if the circumstances are there. So I would expect every business leader to come up with a very clear picture on what is the end state. What does Build Back Better mean for your sector, for your company? And then as an investor, I would really focus my questions and how are you going to manage the transition? Because I think the winners and the losers are not going to be determined by figuring out that we need to electrify transport. The winners and losers will be determined who gets there first in a responsible way. And that's really where the focus now needs to shift.
Yeah.
And Marissa?
And on behalf of the investment community, I would ask for our companies to be more consistent and to provide more disclosure, and really to, as they start to think about their transition plans, and as they start to think about integrating ESG into their operations, to really try to identify and isolate those material factors that are helping to drive their business. So when they see something specific resonating with their consumer base or their employees, being very open about what those factors are, because what investors are calling for is the ability to have that information so they can make informed decisions. So it's to me, it's a lot about the data and the disclosure. And then we add on technology, machine learning, AI. I really think we're on the cusp of being able to provide enough information so you can really pick and choose those winners. And then back them with capital.
Well, thank you to each of you for sharing your perspectives, for raising those questions. And I at least am hopeful that if we were to reconvene in 6 months, much less a year from now, hopefully we'll have slightly new things to talk about as opposed to saying the same things. It feels like we are at a turning point in terms of progress and that much broader recognition of the importance of sustainable investing. So thank you.